Iran is still standing, still firing, still absorbing the hits and hitting back. There is no sign that stops anytime soon. Look at where this war actually is right now. Not where the press releases say it is, but where the math says it is. And the picture is blunt. The United States is losing ground strategically, and it does not have a formula for reversing that. That is not commentary. That is not opinion. That is the operational reality staring every serious analyst in the face right now. The people running this campaign cannot answer the basic question, what does winning actually look like from here? Because there is no clean answer. There is no clear path. And that absence, that strategic void at the center of this entire operation, is the real story. There is an old saying from the Afghan theater that cuts straight to the heart of this problem. You have the watches, but we have the time. That phrase captures the entire asymmetry of this conflict in a single sentence. For Iran, the definition of victory is survival. Stay intact, keep the pressure on, absorb the punishment, outlast the campaign, continue to exist as a functioning state with a functioning military. That is the threshold. It is low, it is achievable. Iran has already demonstrated it can meet that threshold under sustained assault. The bar on the other side is entirely different and far more demanding. Washington and Tel Aviv need to demonstrate the complete eradication of Iranian ballistic missile capability, the dismantling of its nuclear development program, and the delivery of actual regime change, all within a timeline that a fracturing, destabilized global economy simply will not tolerate indefinitely. Time is not neutral in this conflict. Time is a weapon, and Iran is the one holding it. Every day this war continues without a decisive American or Israeli breakthrough is a day Iran wins on its own terms. So how long does the American side actually have before the strategic clock runs out completely? That depends heavily on what happens to the international economy, and that depends almost entirely on how far up the escalation ladder both sides are willing to climb and how fast they climb it. There is no question that the ladder is being climbed right now. The United States and Israel are both moving up step by step, strike by strike. The critical threshold, the rung on that ladder that changes everything, is oil infrastructure. If Iranian oil facilities become a systematic target, Tehran retaliates against petroleum infrastructure across the Gulf states. That is not speculation. That is not a worst-case scenario invented by analysts trying to sound alarming. That is doctrine. That is the stated and demonstrated Iranian response posture. And the Gulf states provide exactly the kind of target-rich environment that Iranian missile and drone forces were built to exploit. Iranian strikes on Gulf petroleum infrastructure would send consequences rippling through the global economy at a speed and at a scale that cannot be managed through press statements, emergency summits, or coordinated central bank responses. That is where the escalation stops being a regional problem and becomes a systemic global one. That is where the damage escapes the theater entirely. Reports are already surfacing that Washington is actively pushing back against Israeli targeting of Iranian oil infrastructure, not for moral reasons, not out of concern for civilian populations, but for cold strategic ones. American planners understand the retaliation dynamic. They understand that if Iranian drones and short-range precision missiles begin systematically destroying Gulf petroleum infrastructure, the economic fallout crosses into catastrophic territory. Even a figure like Lindsey Graham has signaled public frustration at the Israeli targeting calculus. Think about what that signal represents. When that level of institutional political support begins to show visible cracks in public, the fracture underneath is considerably deeper than the surface suggests. That is not a minor data point. That is an indicator of where the internal debate inside the American decision-making structure actually stands right now. But oil is only one part of the vulnerability equation on the Gulf side. The other part is water. This is where the strategic picture gets truly severe and where most mainstream analysis stops short because the implications are too stark, too immediate, and too difficult to frame within the usual language of geopolitical commentary. The Middle East is a desert. The Gulf states depend on desalination plants to sustain their populations. Not partially, fundamentally. Those plants are not hardened military installations buried under reinforced concrete. They are large, concentrated, fixed infrastructure targets sitting in known locations. Iran has short-range precision missiles. Iran has drones. Iran has both in large quantities and has demonstrated the operational capability to deploy them with accuracy. If those desalination plants go offline, not all of them, not even most of them, just enough of them, people do not simply face economic hardship or political instability. They face death quickly. The Iranian military does not need a sophisticated or complex campaign to hold the Gulf states at existential risk. It already has the tools, the range, the targeting data, and the doctrine to execute that threat at any point it chooses. That is what assured destruction looks like outside of nuclear doctrine. The leverage is structural. It is built into the geography itself, and no amount of American air power repositioning changes that underlying reality. Now factor in scale. Iran is not a small or fragile country. Geographically, it is the size of Western Europe. Its population stands at roughly 93 million people, with a deep history of national resistance under foreign military pressure. The idea that sustained air power can break Iranian national will through punishment, the way Gaza has been subjected to systematic, concentrated destruction, is not a serious strategic proposition. It is not logistically achievable, not politically sustainable, and not strategically coherent, given everything known about how populations and states respond to sustained assault. Yes, additional punishment can be delivered. More strikes, more infrastructure damage, more civilian suffering. The capability to inflict pain is real and is not in question, but the historical record on this specific question is not ambiguous and has never been ambiguous. Bombing civilian populations does not cause functional governments to collapse under wartime conditions. It does not cause populations to rise up and overthrow their own state when an external enemy is visibly responsible for their suffering. Historically, the opposite dynamic takes hold. Populations under sustained external attack harden, they consolidate around the state, they absorb the losses and continue. The Iranians specifically fought Iraq for 8 grinding years through the 1980s in one of the most destructive conventional wars of the 20th century. Casualty estimates from that conflict range from 250,000 to 500,000 Iranian dead. Cities were bombed. Chemical weapons were used against Iranian forces and civilian populations. The economy was strangled. The regime survived. Society absorbed the punishment and continued to function. That is the only relevant historical baseline when assessing Iranian resilience under military pressure. That is the reference point that any serious strategic assessment must begin from. Anyone building a campaign strategy around Iranian capitulation through punishment is not engaging with history. They are ignoring the only directly applicable data available to them, so the escalation ladder has rungs, but very few of them lead to anything resembling a decisive outcome. What the United States categorically cannot do is invade. A full-scale ground campaign against Iran, a land invasion in the structural model of Iraq 2003, is simply not available as an option. The political cost domestically would be unsurvivable for any administration, including this one. The operational military cost would be staggering in terms of personnel, equipment, logistics, and timeline. And even if regime change were somehow achieved through overwhelming ground force, the assumption that a post-war Iranian government would align with American strategic interests has no basis in the historical record of this region. That assumption has been tested multiple times across multiple countries, and it has failed every single time without exception. The idea that a post-war Iran dances to Washington's tune, dismantles its own strategic capabilities, and integrates itself into an American-led regional architecture is not a strategy. It is a recycled fantasy assembled from the ruins of previous fantasies. There are 2 smaller, more limited ground options being discussed in strategic circles. The first involves special forces units entering Iranian territory to locate and secure enriched uranium stockpiles, material currently enriched to 60% purity, sitting dangerously close to the 90% threshold required for weapons-grade material. The second involves the possible deployment of the 82nd Airborne to seize Karg Island, a critical node in Iranian petroleum export infrastructure positioned in the Persian Gulf. These operations are not strategic game changers. They are tactical moves with tactical objectives, and it is entirely reasonable to assume that Iranian military planners have already war-gamed both scenarios in considerable detail and have built active defensive responses and countermeasures into their current operational posture. Neither operation, even if executed successfully, produces the strategic outcome the broader campaign requires, neither delivers regime change, neither permanently neutralizes the ballistic missile arsenal, neither resolves the nuclear enrichment question in any durable way. They are operations constructed around specific tactical objectives, operating in a space where no coherent overarching strategy actually exists to give them meaning. What this leaves as the primary instrument is air power. And the historical record on what air power alone can actually achieve against a deeply rooted adversary with strategic depth, distributed military capability, and genuine national will to resist is not a record that inspires confidence. The academic and strategic literature on this question is extensive, and its conclusions are consistent. Air campaigns inflict cost. They destroy infrastructure. They kill people. They degrade specific capabilities over specific timelines. What they do not do, what they have consistently failed to do across the 20th and 21st centuries, is break strategic will, collapse functional regimes, or eliminate distributed military capability in adversaries with genuine depth. Bombing produces tactical results. It does not produce strategic decisions in the adversary's favor. Here is what this campaign is actually doing at a deeper structural level that the immediate headlines consistently fail to capture. It is generating mobilization not just among Iranians absorbing the strikes, but across the entire regional and civilizational landscape connected to this conflict. Shia populations across Iraq, Bahrain, Lebanon, and beyond are watching this campaign and drawing conclusions. Arab and Islamic populations more broadly are processing this war alongside everything happening simultaneously in Gaza and the West Bank. These are not separate issues in the minds of those populations. They are not two distinct policy questions requiring separate analytical frameworks. They are the same story playing out simultaneously in different locations. They confirm the same conclusion about American and Israeli strategic intent in the region. And that conclusion is not softening over time. It is hardening into a permanent, generational strategic shift in how Washington is perceived across the global South. And that shift carries consequences that extend far beyond any single military campaign. Look specifically at where the Gulf states now find themselves. Before this war began, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, these governments were aligned with Washington, operating under American security guarantees, integrated into American-led regional security architecture, and broadly dependent on that relationship for their strategic stability. Now their leadership is confronting a completely different calculation. They are watching the real possibility that their own critical infrastructure, oil platforms, desalination plants, port facilities, population centers, gets systematically destroyed as a direct consequence of their alignment with the American-Israeli campaign against Iran. The question their leadership is being forced to confront openly and urgently is this: is proximity to the United States a security asset or a security liability? That question existed before this war in abstract form. It now exists in operational, immediate, existential form, and the answers being reached privately are predictable to anyone who understands how states calculate interest under pressure. Saudi Arabia was already repositioning before this conflict started. A formal strategic agreement with Pakistan placing a nuclear umbrella over the kingdom had been established. Turkey was actively attempting to attach itself to a Pakistan-Turkey-Saudi alliance architecture, precisely because Ankara has concluded that American security guarantees are no longer reliable, and because Turkish military planners understand that a strategically dismantled Iran does not terminate Israeli expansionist ambition in the broader region. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett made public statements indicating Turkey as a future Israeli strategic target once Iran is dealt with. That is not casual rhetoric. That is a declared strategic trajectory that every government in the region has heard, processed, and is now actively factoring into its long-term alignment decisions. The direction of travel for Saudi Arabia is toward Beijing and Moscow. That trajectory predated this war. This war is accelerating it dramatically. That is a structural shift in the regional order that no air campaign, no matter how sustained, can reverse through force. What this conflict also exposes with brutal clarity is the complete absence of coherent, experienced civilian strategic leadership at the center of the American decision-making apparatus. The negotiating portfolio covering Iran, Palestine, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict simultaneously sits with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, two individuals with no diplomatic training, no formal strategic education, no foreign policy experience of any meaningful depth, and documented, deeply personal ideological commitments to one side of the very conflicts they are supposed to be mediating. That is not simply a personnel management problem. That is a systemic, structural failure of command architecture at the highest level of the American government. Adding Marco Rubio, who holds the dual position of National Security Advisor and Secretary of State simultaneously, two roles that exist in structural tension with each other, does not solve the underlying problem. The strategic intellectual depth required to navigate a conflict of this complexity is simply not present in the room where decisions are being made. J.D. Vance may possess the analytical capacity to understand where this trajectory leads, but his positioning as the likely future standard bearer for this political movement creates an insurmountable constraint on his ability to challenge the course directly and publicly. The council reaching the decision maker is compromised at every level simultaneously, ideologically, experientially, and structurally. The domestic political trajectory follows a pattern that is historically well established and has a hard ceiling. The United States entered this war with roughly 20% public support for military action against Iran, an historically low baseline for any American military campaign. The rally around the flag effect that always follows the initiation of hostilities pushed that number to approximately 40% once operations were underway. That 40% mark represents the high water mark of domestic political support for this campaign. From this point forward, as the war grinds on without producing decisive or visible results, as economic pressure from the conflict accumulates domestically, as the strategic picture clarifies in ways the initial framing concealed, that number moves in one direction only. The Iraq comparison is directly instructive here. Pre-war support for the 2003 invasion ran between 71 and 75%, built on a sustained, sophisticated government-led propaganda campaign that successfully shaped public perception before the first bombs fell. Even from that historically high baseline of manufactured public consensus, support collapsed progressively as the occupation devolved into a strategic catastrophe. This war began with a fraction of that support and without a comparably dominant public persuasion architecture sustaining it. The erosion will be faster and it will be deeper. Foreign Affairs recently compiled a formal survey of American diplomatic historians, asking them to identify the single greatest foreign policy blunder in American history. The 2003 invasion of Iraq ranked first on that list. This war is constructing the foundation for the same historical verdict, potentially a worse one, given the strategic context in which it was launched. The systematic dismantling of international legal frameworks and institutional architecture that this administration represents matters here, not as an abstract normative concern, but as a concrete strategic force multiplier, long-term American power erosion. This is not simply about the legality of the attack on Iran or the targeted assassination of the Ayatollah. It is about a documented, consistent pattern of treating international law as an operational obstacle to be navigated around rather than a structural constraint that serves American long-term interests, a pattern that mirrors the identical approach applied domestically to American law, American institutions, congressional authority, and judicial oversight. The European response to this pattern has been its own distinct strategic failure with its own distinct long-term consequences. Europe, historically the primary institutional backbone of international legal norms, the actor most vocally committed to rules-based international order, has largely deferred and accommodated rather than confronted and resisted. Spain stands as the notable exception. The broader European capitulation has eliminated what should have functioned as a significant counterweight and has accelerated the legitimacy erosion of the post-war international order, in the eyes of the global South in ways that will outlast this specific conflict by decades. 3 years remain in this administration's operational term. The damage compounds daily across multiple interconnected theaters. The Ukraine war, now systematically starved of media attention and increasingly starved of the material flows it requires, is deteriorating for Kiev in ways that barely register in Western coverage dominated by the Iranian theater. Russian energy revenues are rising directly as a consequence of this conflict and the oil market disruptions it has generated. The American economic pressure campaign, designed to isolate and gradually strangle the Russian war economy, has been functionally abandoned. Washington is now explicitly telling New Delhi that purchasing Russian oil is acceptable, a complete public reversal of the previous policy position that American diplomats spent considerable effort enforcing. The Russian military-industrial machine benefits directly. The pipeline of weaponry and ammunition flowing toward Ukraine faces new constraints as American production capacity, existing stockpiles are redirected towards sustaining the Middle East campaign. THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems are being physically relocated from East Asian positioning, creating immediate and serious security gaps in South Korea that Seoul has publicly protested, because the demand generated by operations in the Gulf cannot be met from existing forward deployments. General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, told the president explicitly before this war began that American munitions stockpiles and production capacity were insufficient to sustain a prolonged conventional military campaign in the Middle East. That assessment was delivered, that warning was dismissed. The operational consequences of that dismissal are now embedded permanently in the strategic reality confronting American commanders across multiple theaters simultaneously. The endgame that is becoming visible is not a defined military victory. It is an exit, a managed withdrawal from an escalation dynamic that has not produced and will not produce the outcomes that justified its initiation. Washington is already searching for an off-ramp. The signals are visible in the reporting if the framing is stripped away. American planners are resisting escalation against Iranian oil infrastructure. Israeli planners are pushing for exactly that escalation. That gap between the two nominal partners in this campaign is not a minor tactical disagreement about targeting priorities. It is a fundamental strategic divergence between two actors who entered this campaign with different definitions of what victory actually means, and radically different tolerances for the economic and geopolitical consequences of continued escalation. If that gap widens into an open public confrontation, if Washington moves to de-escalate and Tel Aviv openly resists, the resulting rupture will do more lasting damage to the Israel lobby's institutional grip on American foreign policy than any academic paper, any congressional testimony, or any public advocacy campaign mounted over the past 20 years. That reckoning may be approaching. Whether it arrives in time to meaningfully limit the strategic damage already accumulating is the question nobody in either capital wants to answer directly. This is not a war that resolves in the outcome its architects promised before the first strike was launched. The Iranian state survives. The ballistic missile arsenal survives, possibly larger and more dispersed than when this campaign began. The nuclear incentive has been transformed from a strategic consideration into an overwhelming, undeniable, rational imperative. The lesson Iran is drawing from this experience, the lesson every regional observer and every non-nuclear state watching this unfold is drawing, is stark and simple. North Korea made the correct decision, and Iran made the wrong one by not following that path sooner. When this war finally concludes, the drive toward weapons-grade nuclear capability in Tehran will not require internal political debate. It will be the obvious, rational, strategically necessary response to everything that has happened since February 28th. The strategic situation that exists on the other side of this conflict will be measurably, structurally worse than the situation that existed before the first bomb dropped. Not marginally worse in ways that can be managed and absorbed. Fundamentally, architecturally, permanently worse, across every dimension that matters to American strategic interests in the region and globally. That is the real outcome this campaign is producing. That is where this ends. And the strategic logic that made this outcome inevitable was visible, legible, and documented before the first decision to act was ever made.